Hi everyone, Sean here and welcome to my Elden Ring build guide for what I like to call the Elemental Champion. This is the PvE version of this build and I'll probably make a separate video for the PvP version as it is a tiny bit different. But with this build comes a wide variety of options available to us as we are primarily building Intelligence and Faith as our primary stats. The theme I went for with this build is obviously the elements, and we're going to incorporate a bunch of different ones in this build, primarily fire and quote ice, which is really magic damage. So let's go over the build. Let's go over the pros first. The biggest pro of this build is that it's a jack of all trades. With most spells being available to us, we can do damage, heal, and buff. We can also do decent melee damage thanks to the Sword of Night and Flame and the Ash of War system in general. And because of this versatility, resistances are hardly an issue because we have access to a lot of different damage types. We've got some solid defenses. We're not exactly a tank, but we're not made of glass either, so think of this more like an off tank. Our damage isn't too shabby either. We have a few tricks up our sleeve to do some crazy damage even with our rather middling stats. I'll go over this a little bit more later, but since we have access to both fire and frostbite, the interaction between the two can turn this into a bit of a mini bleed build, if you will. And lastly, we've got some pretty good AoEs on us. It's not exactly hard to nuke down a whole pack of enemies before they notice us. Sadly, there are some cons to this build. The first one being is that we are the master of none. As such is the curse of being the jack of all trades. We'll be easily outclassed by people who have decided to specialize in one specific thing. While this does clear things pretty fast, it's not going to be stupidly fast, so if this is what you're looking for in a build, this guide is more than likely not for you. This is a very FP hungry build when it comes to using our spells and our arts. It is manageable, but we will have to work around it by using either more flasks or putting more points into mind. This build is also susceptible to being ambushed. Even though we have some really strong AoEs, they have really long charge times or really long cast times, so getting them off in the middle of a fight where we're surrounded by a bunch of enemies already just isn't really going to work. So we're going to have to be very careful about what it is we're going up against. And lastly, we don't have any solid long-ranged options. We only have one spell that can take care of that. But for the most part, this build operates in close to mid-range, and anything further than that is going to be kind of a pain in our side. For our starting class, we have three choices. We got the Confessor, Vagabond, or Wretch. Now, if you don't really care about the PvP meta and plan on leveling beyond what the level meta is, which I'm still not sure what it is, then your starting class really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. However, I think these classes still have their own edge in giving you that start that you might want. The Confessor is the class I started off with, and this build is going to be centered around that. It starts off with 12 strength and 12 dexterity, which is the minimum requirements for those two stats on the Sword of Night and Flame. Other noticeable stats are the 13 mind and the 14 faith, which are two stats we're going to build anyway, so this is a pretty good head start for us. It also comes with some decent starting equipment. It comes with a broadsword as well as a blue crest heater shield. The shield has 100% physical damage negation, so we can block attacks without any fear of getting hurt, just as long as we have enough stamina for it. Urgent Heal is also very handy for helping us save flasks. Here are the final stats for our build. We've got 52 Vigor, 40 Mind, 14 Endurance, 12 Strength, and 12 Dexterity, 45 Intelligence, and 45 Faith, and 9 Arcane. Our end goal, not necessarily our first priority, is to get our Intelligence and Faith to 45. Why it's not higher is because of our main weapon, the Gilmer Glintstone Staff, which I'll go over when I cover equipment. But we don't want to bum rush all our points into getting these to 45. We really need the health, so make sure to spend some points in vigor along the way. At least 40 is sufficient. 40 mine is also a good stopping point because any more than that will require more than one flask to top ourselves off, and there really isn't anything that needs so much FP that we dry ourselves out in the middle of traversing a dungeon or fighting a boss. This will leave us with 16 extra points at level 150, so use those how you see fit. I've chosen to get enough endurance from my equipment and then the rest into vigor to have a really beefy amount of HP. Okay, so for our equipment, let's start off with the weapons. Our first weapon is going to be the Gelmer Glintstone Staff. I have centered this build around this weapon. It boosts lava sorceries and scales with both intelligence and faith. It drops off of one enemy in the entire game, and the drop rate for it is extremely low. So if that's not something you want to put yourself through, the Prince of Death is a good alternative since you can easily just find it. Speaking of which, the reason we aren't using the Prince of Death staff is because it's actually worse at these intelligence and faith levels. It's not until it hits 50 in both that it actually beats the Gelmer Glintstone staff, while at the same time the scaling on the latter plummets, gaining us only 5 points from 45 to 50. So if you're planning on using this, it might be a good idea to invest those remaining 16 points into beefing your intelligence and faith up. To complement our staff, the Golden Order Seal will allow us to have some very strong incantations. I haven't done very much testing, but from what several people on Reddit and other various sources have discovered, this will beat out other seals due to its scaling evenly with 2 different stats. Even in the schools, those seals buff. It's also nice to just consolidate all of our incantations into this one seal anyway. And for our main melee weapon, we have the Sword of Night and Flame. Even though it was nerfed recently, it's still a pretty solid weapon. I also don't believe there are any other melee weapons in the game that scales off of both intelligence and faith, so this is probably the best bet. There are plenty of videos on this weapon already, so I'm not really going to go in depth of why we are using this, so just check it out. And for our last armament, it's just simply any straight sword with cold infusion on it. I picked the Lord Sworn straight sword for this, but any sword will do. We want a straight sword so we can power stance this with the Sword of Night and Flame. We also want a normal one so we can use Bloodhound Step in case we run into any hard to dodge issues. It's a really powerful defensive art that's probably going to get nerfed in the future, so if that happens, I'll try to update this in the comments of this video. Lastly, it's cold infused so we can build Frostbite. I also have a second copy of this in case I really want to build that Frostbite as much as possible. For armor, I don't want to say it doesn't matter because it kinda doesn't, but it also kinda does. I say it kinda doesn't because I did beat this game for the first time using some of the lightest armor in the game, and I did relatively okay. And in this case, I'm not wearing the heaviest things possible. I'm still doing Fashion Souls. But if you really want to up your performance, most of the equipment that will do that is in our head slot. The most notable thing would be the Snow Witch hat, as it's the only thing in this game that boosts cold sorceries, which obviously we're using a lot of. I'm personally not using it because it doesn't match, but if that doesn't matter to you, or if it looks really nice on something you are wearing along with it, this is a great choice. When it comes to talismans, this build can make great use of a lot of them since we have the base stats to back them up, but here are the main 4 that I use. The first one is the Rotten Sword Insignia. Since I'm power stancing straight swords, the bonus from this comes up quite often. Of course, it doesn't beat out Twin Blades or other fast weapons, but the bonus comes up more often than not. Our next talisman is the Moon of Noxtella. We're using a lot of spells, and a lot of those spells use up more than one memory slot. So having the extra memory is very helpful for this, but if you know what you're up against and don't need the extra slots, trade this for something else. Then we have the Old Lord's Talisman. This is such an important part of this build because we are using 2 buffs, and one of them is extremely short. While the duration only gets boosted by 30%, those extra seconds do add up. But because this shows up so late in the game, something else will need to take this spot. And what I was using up until I got the Old Lord's Talisman was the Great Jar's Arsenal. This is also why you'll probably see some footage of me wearing completely different armor. But building up our endurance to wear heavier things is not such a great idea since the returns diminish so heavily for points invested after 25. So if you want to wear heavier armor and be tankier, this is probably the best way to do that. Then lastly, we've got the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. This is more of a flex spot, but I picked this because we are primarily a melee character still. Our spells don't exactly have a lot of reach, so even if we're trying to nuke things, we're still in the thick of things a lot of the time. But just like the other talismans, this isn't entirely necessary, so you can also change this out for something else. So as you've heard, 3 of these 4 talismans are kind of flex spots all on their own. So experiment and find out what works best for you. And now we have our spell selection. This is such a complicated part of this build, and this is the reason why I've chosen to script this whole thing out. If I don't, I just end up rambling and we'll be here forever. So I'll just cover what I feel are our core spells and the things we'll be using the most. So our 2 core buffs are Golden Vow and Flame Grants Me Strength. These are both damage buffs, and Golden Vow also buffs our defense, which is a nice added bonus. Flame Grant Me Strength only lasts 30 seconds, sadly, so it's a little difficult to make the most out of it. Use it at the start of boss fights, and if you can, when you know a burst window is about to pop up. And then our next spell is Roiling Magma. This is such a crazy spell. What's sad about this, though, is that the game does a horrible job of explaining what this does. There are 2 things that can happen. If this hits an enemy, it's just a simple projectile that does okay damage. But if it hits a non-enemy surface, like the ground or a wall, the rock will stick, grow, and then explode for a lot of damage, which is what the game explains. What it doesn't tell you, though, is that if you plant this near an enemy and they haven't noticed you yet, they will actually walk up to it like a moth to a flame, even if their back is turned to it. Because of this, it's probably one of the more effective AoE alpha strikes in the game. Kind of acts like a suction or like a vortex, and it's just really, really good. This doesn't always happen though, so try your best to aim this in a spot, assuming that will be the case. And next up is Rykard's Rancor, or Rancor. I'm not entirely sure how to say that, but this is our core spell, and I made the mistake of not trying to get this spell right away. If I were you, I would try and grab this ASAP if you plan on using it. I haven't seen what a low-level Rykard boss fight looks like, but it might be worth looking into. There are probably a bunch of videos on this spell already, so I'll just try to keep it as brief as possible. This just destroys big things and anything stupid enough to stay in one spot. However, I feel this is best used in conjunction with fighting up close. That way you can force your target to stay put while they try to deal with you and not this spell. One other cheeky thing you can do with this is to send this spell out, and then while it's flying around, try to inflict frostbite as much as you can. The damage will rack up very fast because the fire from this spell will reset frostbite while also doing a ton of work itself. And for our ice spells, we've got Adula's Moonblade and Glintstone Icecrag. These are going to be our spell versions of trying to inflict frostbite, as well as doing magic damage on top of that. Adula's Moonblade is much stronger and will be our go-to if we can use this safely. If not, Glintstone Icecrag is our next option. It's still pretty short ranged, especially when compared to the normal Glintstone counterparts. And lastly, Lightning Spear. This is our long-range option. If we need to snipe something, this is pretty much the only thing we have, so hope that your target isn't resistant to lightning if you choose to go that route. Lightning is also effective against enemies wearing metal armor, which tend to be some pretty dangerous enemies. Again, these aren't exactly all the spells I use. Some honorable mentions are the bestial incantations. Since our damage is split on our melee weapons, these are great for dealing pure physical damage and also fits the criteria for earth elemental magic. So we've got that avatar vibe going. For those spells, Bestial Sling and Stone of Gurranq are probably the best two in that school. If you also want to add some more physical damage, the Gravity Sorceries also function the same. And lastly, Triple Rings of Light in the Fundamentalist School is also a pretty solid option for clearing groups. The game plan for this build isn't too complex. Just assess what you're up against and use the best option, and that's basically what this boils down to. Fighting something weak to fire, use fire spells. Is it weak to frostbite? Use ice spells or whatever means necessary to proc it, which you have a lot of. It does take some trial and error, or just looking up a guide if this is your first playthrough, but it's not too bad. As I've mentioned in the spell section, frostbite gets reset from actual fire, not fire damage from a weapon. So you need to actually see fire come out, and once it makes contact with that, the proc gets reset. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you're gonna have to wait till it wears off before you can do it again. The downside is that the defense buff this applies also gets removed, so decide if you want to reset it or not. This alternating loop of frost and fire is the main way we're going to do a lot of damage if we really need to. And that is the end of this build guide. I'm going to leave some more gameplay footage to show off this build some more. Please be sure to leave a like if you did like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to see more future build guides and other things. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you all later.